Multi-Dimensional Poverty Index is bringing together top government officials, development partners, and key players in the economic sector to put forward the findings of the survey. The survey, which sampled over 56,000 households across the 36 states of the Federation and the FCT, conducted between November 2021 and February 2022, states that 65% of poor Nigerians, representing 86 million people, live in the north, while 35%, nearly 47 million, live in the south.
Why the monetary measurement of poverty make use of consumption expenditure as a means of determining the level of poverty? The MPI approach uses deprivation in basic amenities as a means of determining the level of poverty.
At the Ministry of Finance, Budget and National Planning, we will continue to play our oversight role as the government's institution tasked with policy and project designs, as well as the monitoring and evaluation of projects. In this context, the MPI will be used to systematically track progress against the Sustainable Development Goal 1.
The measure used to calculate the figure was based on the Multi-Dimensional Poverty Index, MPI, and contains 5 components: health, living standard, education, security, and underemployment. While the report identifies Sokoto State as having the most poverty levels across states with 91% and Ondo with the lowest at 27%, children, women, and persons living with disabilities are worst hit. The figures come with concerns from development partners.
We need to understand poverty as a phenomenon that is affecting children in different ways, whether it is monetary or multidimensional.
However, the federal government says more investments will be made to change the narrative.
This is a report that pinpoints the level of deprivations and its intensity that confronts our citizens, all of them. Beyond this, it also provides substantive evidence of the positive impact of the multi-sectoral interventions of the Buhari administration, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic, which also demonstrated our commitment to eradicating extreme poverty in Nigeria.
The survey is then launched. This is expected to serve as a wake-up call to the government on how to allocate its resources and provide policies that will address the gaps identified.
And to assess this report now, we have Sam Chidoka, MD, Kairos Capital, joining us via Zoom. Great to have you on the program. Listening to that report, quite a staggering amount there, 133 million. What were your thoughts when you saw this report?
Well, first things first is to say that data is important. If you don't know what the problem is, then you can't prefer adequate solution. So the first thing that came to my mind was that it was good we invested, and we now know what the numbers are, what the figures are. You know, we've always had that discussion about 100 million Nigerians living in poverty. Now we know it's not 100 million Nigerians as far as multidimensional poverty is concerned. We're talking of 133 million Nigerians. So the challenge is even more. The last World Bank report I read was targeting that very soon we're going to get 100 million in abject poverty. But now the multidimensional poverty report states we have 133 million Nigerians living in that type of poverty. So now it's easier to have targeted approach to solving the problem. So the first thing I'll say, kudos to having the data, but now a lot of work needs to be done.
Yeah, quite a lot of work. But in your opinion, how did we get here?
So we got here from over time of not making the right investments in the right things. I've always been the proponent of the fact that I don't have a problem with subsidy, but I think we're subsidizing the wrong things. I think that we're subsidizing fuel consumption, and I think that that's wrong to subsidize. Subsidy from fuel, in my opinion, should be removed, and we should subsidize things like education, like healthcare. So if you look at the report says that a lot of Nigerians don't have access to healthcare, don't have access to quality education, don't have access to water, the clean environment, sanitation, and all of that. So if you take the quantum of subsidy, which from reports could be 6 trillion naira in the year 2022, and even invest 50% of that in subsidizing education and healthcare, I think the multiplier effect of that will be more than subsidizing fuel. So we got here from not making the right investments, especially in healthcare, especially in education. Today we have 4 doctors to 1,000 patients. That can't work.
Yeah, that definitely cannot work. But, you know, we've seen rising inflation globally, and we see central bankers, you know, battling, you know, inflation right now with rate hikes. Looking at this number of 133 million Nigerians, you know, poor, is this the best policy, you know, for Nigeria, raising rates?
Well, so there's the theory of inflation, and if you look at it theoretically, it's a good policy to tighten when you have inflation. But again, I think that economics will tell you that there are different types of inflation, whether you have the demand side inflation or supply side inflation. So the way you try and manage it will be different depending on the type of inflation that you have. I think we have a supply side inflation in Nigeria, and tightening alone cannot solve it. I think that we need to do more than tightening. So on the monetary policy side, the central bank and the monetary policy committee have done what they can do in increasing rates and trying to rein in inflation. Has it worked? Well, the speed of growth of inflation has sort of like beginning to taper down, but inflation is still on the rise. We're now at over 21% for last month. However, it's not rising as quickly as we saw in the last few months. But you need concentrated and coordinated effort from the managers of the economy. On the fiscal side, we need to see some, you can't be tightening on the monetary policy and then by ways and means funding the government with 20 trillion naira. It just doesn't align. So there has to be a coordinated and concerted effort between the monetary policy side and the fiscal policy side to try and rein in inflation like we've seen it. Because the more you tighten only and don't deal with the fiscal issues, then over time, the tightening will begin to affect even access to capital formation, begin to affect small businesses. They can't borrow anymore. If you go to borrow from a bank and the rate is 30%, what legitimate business are you going to do in Nigeria to pay back 30% and still make a profit?
And looking at the number, it did exceed, you know, the World Bank's forecast. So looking at it, you know, right now, 133, you know, million people. Assuming, let's take for instance, the government is not, you know, doing the right thing. How do you, as a person, lift yourself out of this poverty?
Well, so now the question is, what do you do regardless? So in terms of where we are today, households and individuals must begin to see that we have to have, first of all, multiple streams of income. We live in an environment now where the average household is not earning enough to pay their bills and pay school fees for children, put food on the table and roof over their head. You need to have a situation where households are sharing the responsibility. The theory of housewife is basically not fashionable anymore. You need to have a situation where the man is contributing, the woman is contributing, the grown-up adults of the family are also contributing. You need to also look at, this is not a time when only a 9-to-5 job might be enough. You have to find other streams of income. And just based on technology and based on the fact that I'm speaking to you from Yaba, you're in your studio, people can look at all manners of avenues to sell products. So I mean, people are selling products on Instagram, on Facebook, on Twitter, and all of that without moving from where they are. So individuals will have to be creative and find ways of covering the gap. Government cannot do it all. Agriculture is another way that we can look at. But I dare say that what we need to grow the economy is not subsistence agriculture. It is massive mega investment in agriculture that will help us in that space. But for households, you can at least cultivate what you eat.
What would you say, is the impact of this, for the Nigerian economy? What's the expected impact going forward?
Well, so it's a number that is key. Like I said, the data is good. If you fail to plan, you have planned to fail. And if you don't have the right data, you make the wrong plan, right? So data is good, and it's good that we have data. What this means is that the managers of the economy now know what to do in terms of the question we need to ask ourselves. 7 years ago, we started the trader money, giving money to SMEs, giving money to families, trying to give some, financial aid to those who didn't have the wherewithal to survive by themselves. So 7 years after the school feeding program, all of those programs, the question we have to ask ourselves is, are those programs working? If they are not working, we tweak them. Change is constant. The fact that we started something doesn't mean we must continue it in perpetuity. Now that we have data, my recommendation to government is to sit down and ask ourselves, the compulsory cash transfer that we're doing, is it working? If it's not working, change it. We've seen the fact that lack of access to education is what contributes massively to this multi-dimensional poverty. So feeding program, is it bringing children back to school? If it's not, we change it and we find another way to make it work. So on a macro level and even on a micro level, for the managers of the economy, we need to mine this data and we need to help use it in taking decisions. The data is not just meant to be something that we launch, but something that should guide us in decision making.
But the report shows multidimensional poverty is more pronounced, in rural areas. About 72% of people are poor, compared to urban areas where it's about 42%. What do you think can be done to tackle that rural poverty?
So that's not unexpected. If you look at the structure of our economy and look at access to just basic infrastructure, the rural area, there are still areas in Nigeria that are cut off from some rural areas in Nigeria. They can only move their goods and services through water. They don't have roads or bridges to connect them to the farm, from the farm gate to the market gate, right? So we need to begin to invest more in rural infrastructure. There are still rural areas in Nigeria that do not have access to electricity. There are rural areas in Nigeria that don't have access to internet of any sort. So when I speak about selling your product on Instagram or all of that, based on lack of education, that they don't even know, they don't have access to internet, they don't understand how to do this. So you would expect that rural poverty will be more. What government needs to do is to do what China did. So if you look at China, there's a report from the Ministry of Finance of China of 4 decades of removing people from poverty. And I think that report is instructive for any country that wants to achieve the same thing, because they did it in the last 40 years. So one of the things they did was that they targeted the particular areas that they found had persistent and consuming poverty, and opened up those areas, provided education. And please, when I talk about education, education is not just about teaching English language or teaching physics, chemistry, and biology. Education could be technical education. Education doesn't have to be formal education. So we need to invest in education in the rural areas, infrastructure in the rural area. We need to invest in putting electricity in the rural area, and just the general providing security for the rural area. Many of them are farmers, but with the farmer header crisis we're having, many can't go to farm. So you will see that the rural area will have higher poverty levels.
And looking at this data now, we have the MPC meeting coming, next week. How do you think this would, shape their decision going forward?
Again, like I said, for the MPC is targeted at monetary policy. And monetary policy in itself alone cannot solve the challenges that we face as a nation on a macro scale. It just cannot. We used to have an office called the Coordinating Minister of the Economy. We no longer have it. I recommend strongly that we go back to that, where there is that handshake between the monetary policy and the fiscal policy. The monetary policy is not a silver bullet that cures all. Because you see, economists are battling with exchange rate, interest rate, unemployment, all those things are the things that economies are battling, and you're trying to solve them. Most times it's difficult to solve all of them. What you can do is to try to reduce the effects of all of them at the same time, but not entirely stop. They're also battling inflation. So what the monetary policy I expect them to do is to continue the trajectory of holding back inflation, which has massive effect on households, because whilst the CPI points at 21%, food inflation is over 23%. And that's not good for an economy where 133 million people have a multi-dimensional poverty. So the monetary policy is just not enough. I would expect them to continue the trajectory that they've been going, but I dare say that it's just not enough.
Yeah, quite incredible having such a huge population in poverty and seeing prices, rise so fast at the same time. Thank you so much, Sam Chidoka, MD, Kairos Capital. It was great having your perspective.
Thanks for having me.